In the summer of 1833, beneath the heavy sun and red earth of rural Georgia, the Harwood plantation began to collapse, not from drought, nor from the failing of crops, but from something that crept quietly into the nursery. At first it seemed nothing more than a fever. One child struck, then another. Their foreheads burned, their lips trembled, their bodies weakened each evening around the supper table. Local physicians rode out in haste, their bags rattling with the trusted instruments of their trade. They bled the children. They purged them. They forced draughts down trembling throats. Yet, the more they treated, the thinner and quieter the children became. And always at the end of each day, when the house grew silent and candles flickered in the humid air, there was only one thing the children would take: a bowl of broth. Ladled, steadily spooned carefully by the nurse who never left their side. Down in the quarters, other children vanished too, though theirs were not recorded with such precision. Graves grew numerous. Burials were hurried names, unmarked little mounds topped only with stones. Years later, when surveyors mapped the plantation cemetery, they noticed what had been written in the margins of old parish records. Words crossed out. Bones described as disturbed remains, found incomplete. The notes trailed off mid-sentence, as though even the priests could not bring themselves to finish the truth. But truth survived elsewhere. It survived in the whispers passed down in kitchens and cabins, in stories told quietly at night when the fields could not overhear. They said the nurse was not feeding herbs, nor poison. She was feeding memory. That she ground bones stolen from the child graves of the quarters, stirring them into the broth. That each portion given to the master's heirs carried with it the vengeance of those already buried. That with every sip, the children of the house consumed the silence of the graves below. No record names her, no burial preserves her. The archive reduces her life to 3 words only: woman, deceased. But the evidence left in fragments, missing bones, erased names, ledgers where lines fall suddenly silent, suggests something darker than folklore. Something history never dared to write plainly. This then is not superstition. This is the macabre history of the nurse who fed children the bones of their kin. If you want to hear more of the stories history tried to bury, you are in the right place. This is the 7th mark. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And remember, some silences last longer than death itself. The ledger of the Harwood plantation for the summer of 1833 begins as most do. At first, the ordinary matters of life notes of crop yields the tally of enslaved labor, a margin entry about the birth of a calf. Then on the 13th of June, a line unlike the rest appears. Written with a heavier hand, the ink blotted the pressure so deep it almost tears the paper. It reads, "The boy fevered unbroken." The boy was 9 years old, the eldest son of the household, already strong enough to ride the pastures, to follow his father's shadow into the fields. And yet, what follows in the ledger is not strength but only decline. Night sweats, thirst unending, weakness of limbs. The overseer who copied these words from the master's dictation did so with neat indifference. The script cold, detached, as though he were recording hogs slaughtered or cotton bales pressed. Illness reduced to numbers. The doctor arrived 2 days later, summoned from the nearest town. His kit carried the remedies of the age lancets for blood-letting vials of calomel powder, pewter spoons for dosing. He began with purges declaring the fever was born of corrupted bile. When that failed, he cut open the boy's arm and caught the blood in a dish, the iron scent filling the air. Still the fever held. The journal preserves these attempts in flat mechanical terms: bled, calomel given, no change. But as the weeks passed, the writing itself began to falter. Letters, stretched ink smeared the master's hand uneven. The boy wasted to a shadow, his skin ashen, his eyes heavy-lidded. By the 4th week, he could not rise from bed. Outside, the Georgian summer pressed against the walls like a wet cloth. The heat, swelled wood-spoiled food warped the very air. In the nursery, the smell was sharp sweat mixed with vinegar candle wax melting beside unused instruments. Visitors noted how strangely quiet the house had become. The usual laughter of children gone replaced by the shallow rattle of fevered lungs. And through all of it, one detail repeats across every surviving letter and account. The child ate nothing, drank nothing but the broth. A tin bowl carried each evening set before him by the same steady nurse. The doctor even praised her persistence. The woman keeps him fed when nothing else may pass his lips. But within days of each portion, the boy declined further. His lips cracked. His thirst grew beyond quenching. And the refrain of that summer, spoken softly but always present, remained the same. Why would the fever never break? Each night, the master paced the wooden floorboards, his boots scuffing grooves into the planks. Each night, his wife knelt in the parlor, whispering prayers until her voice grew hoarse. And each night, the broth was carried upstairs. The physician returned again and again, his bag always the same, his hands repeating the same gestures as though ritual itself might bend the fever to his will. He bled the boy once more, dosed him once more, prescribed the same purges with the same stubborn conviction. Yet, through it all, the fever did not yield. The ledger kept by the overseer grew thinner as July bled into August. Each entry shorter, each phrase pared to its bone, still wasting. Sleep near constant, no cure, and always in the shadows of those words was the nurse, silent, patient, pouring. Spoon in hand, steady arms holding the boy upright as he swallowed. She spoke little, yet her presence filled every corner of the sick room. She was the rhythm of the boy's breath, the hand that cooled his brow, the figure by the bed when even the master and mistress withdrew in despair. By the time August scorched the fields outside the ledger, no longer recorded treatments but only decline. The boy's name, once repeated with hope, faded from the page. It is not his death that closes the record, but a phrase instead almost abstract in its cruelty. Fever unbroken. Illness resistant to all reason. And yet, behind the doctor's failures and the family's grief, another rhythm ran. A pattern visible only in retrospect. For the fever tightened, not when the boy starved, but when he ate. His weakness deepened most after the steaming bowls were carried upstairs, the broth pressed gently to his lips. He was not undone in spite of nourishment. He was undone because of it. But what was carried in those bowls? And why did each mouthful draw him closer to the grave? The nurse's presence in the archive is almost nothing. She is not in the parish registers where baptisms and marriages are written in neat black ink. She is not in the family Bible where the master carefully recorded the births of his children alongside the yield of crops and the year's weather. She surfaces only once. In the estate inventory of 1831, a brief functional description. Woman, age uncertain, no name, no origin, no ties of kin, nothing. And yet, within the household, she was constant. She was the one who rose before dawn, who lifted the smallest from their beds, who tied laces with practiced hands. She was the one whose low voice lulled them to sleep when night crept in, whose hands wiped brows and faces, who held trembling bodies through the dark. In memory, she was always there, by the hearth, in the nursery, in the silence between the children's cries. They called her mommy, but not as kin, not as blood. That word was given to her as a mask, as a role that replaced her true name. Her real self was folded away each time the children clung to her skirts. She was not a woman in their eyes, not a life with a story, but a function that could be endlessly filled, endlessly replaced. The nursery logs where food and clothing were measured in tidy columns reveal her only indirectly. Rations tallied, garments issued, children's weights recorded like the crops in the fields. But nowhere the name of the one who coaxed them to eat, who steadied their steps, who listened when nightmares shook them from sleep. Her labor was invisible, her presence acknowledged only in the absence of anyone else. Those who recall the plantation later spoke of her as quiet, tireless, spectral. They could not name her face, only the outline of her service. The mammy, the nurse, the faithful woman. She was always near the sick room, always near the hearth. When the master rode out, she remained. When the mistress retired, she carried on. She knew the children's bodies more intimately than their parents did. Their cries, their appetites, the fragile rhythm of their breathing as fever overtook them. But her silence was not mere obedience. It was deeper. A silence that unsettled as much as it comforted. A silence that grew heavy in the nursery air, broken only by the creak of a cradle, the hiss of a candle burning low. To the children, she was indispensable. To the record, she was invisible. That imbalance became its own kind of power. For the planter's ledgers are meticulous when it comes to livestock, to acres, to the value of tools. Yet here in the household where she touched every life, there is no line but one. Woman. Age uncertain. Even her years refused to be fixed, as though she lived outside the calendar, caught in a role that had neither beginning nor end. Fragments of testimonies survive, scattered in the recollections of neighbors, overseers' wives, and parish clerks, each fragment naming her only by absence. The mammy, the nurse, the faithful woman. They did not know her story. They did not speak her name. The more she gave, the less she remained herself. And yet, in that inertia lay her danger. To be unnamed was to slip the chains of account, to move unseen between the lines of ledgers, to stand at the bedside, trusted cradling the master's air, and in that trust to hold a quiet, unspoken power. How could the most trusted figure in the house, the woman permitted to cradle children against her chest, to feed them with her own hand, become its deepest threat? The parish registry for July of 1833 contains one more entry. Under the heading, Deaths in the Negro Quarters, a single line, formulaic and cold. Child age 4, buried at nightfall, and then silence. No name, no parent listed, no cause of death. A life reduced to a single line in a clerk's ledger, sandwiched between marriages and land deeds, as if the child's existence was already half forgotten the moment the ink dried. The burial was carried out after sundown, when the fields lay silent, and the cicadas dulled the air with their hum. A shallow grave was dug at the edge of the quarters close to the tree line, where the earth was softer, where stones did not resist the spade. Those who gathered sang hymns under their breath, the words hushed, carried only as far as the rasp of shovels in the dirt. The ritual was quick, almost furtive, shaped less by reverence than by necessity. The plantation house gave no acknowledgement. No candle was lit. No prayer spoken within its walls. Decades later, when surveyors studied the cemetery, they found the mound where that child had been laid. The soil was uneven, not compacted as graves should be. When the ground was opened again, something was wrong. Bones were missing. Not the long bones of legs or arms, but the smallest ones, delicate, fragile, the kind that could fit easily into the folds of a cloth. No signs of animal burrows. No collapse of soil. The absence bore the shape of human hands. The ledger of the plantation offers no mention of this child. The space where the loss should have been recorded instead turns abruptly to another note of illness, this time within the big house. The planter's second son, 7 years old, was struck by sudden fever. The description is eerily familiar, echoing that of his older brother weeks before. Weakness in the limbs. Night sweats. A thirst water could not quench. The diary line is terse, impatient. Even second boy fevered. July 12th. It is easy to miss when read across separate pages. One child laid into the earth below, another struck ill above. But when aligned, the timing sharpens into something more. Each fever in the master's house shadowed a grave in the quarters. Each decline followed a burial, as if the ground itself demanded balance. The earth below feeding a sickness above. Those who remembered the summer later whispered of the connection, though none dared speak it aloud. A child buried, another struck ill. The nurse tending both ends of that passage, the spade in one hand, the spoon in the other. Her presence at the grave was noted. Even when the hymn ended and the mourners drifted back to their cabins, she lingered, crouched low in the dirt, her hands busy in the soil. No one questioned her grief. No one imagined what she might be taking from the earth. The parish note is silent. The overseer's journal mentions only Mammy, late to house. The planter's record names the fever, but not its cause. Silence preserved her. Silence was the cloak that hid the truth more securely than soil could. And yet, the evidence remained. Not in words, but in absence. The disturbed mound, the missing bones, the fever rising upstairs as the hymn faded in the quarters. Patterns that at the time seemed coincidence. Patterns that decades later read like design. The second boy lay sweating in his sheets, the candlelight drawing shadows across the hollows of his cheeks. At dusk, as always, a tin bowl was carried up the stairs. Broth ladled in steady portions. The same hand lifting spoon to lips, the same quiet voice coaxing him to swallow. And each night, his fever burned higher. No purge touched it. No prayer moved it. In the household ledger, this too became nothing more than a column of decline. Why did illness strike the planter's family only when the quarters buried one of their own? Why did one child's silence beneath the soil echo so swiftly in the wasting of another above it? The record offers no answer, only the alignment of events. Only the whisper of earth turned over and the echo of the first small grave. The kitchen ledger of July 1833 is more revealing. Its columns list the rhythm of daily consumption cornmeal, salt pork molasses, all measured in dwindling quantities. Then in a separate column, one line repeats with unusual insistence: broth daily. Unlike the rations of the quarters, which were counted by weight and measure, this broth was prepared for the master's household alone. Carried upstairs each evening in a tin bowl, its steam rising into the dusk. The nurse oversaw its making. No one else was permitted near the pot. She stirred through long afternoons when the air was heavy and the house lay still. Servants recalled the sight of her figure, bent low over the fire steam, clouding her face until it seemed she had none at all. She kept others at a distance. Once, when a housemaid drew too near, the nurse raised the ladle sharply, as though the contents themselves were forbidden to other eyes. It was understood this task was hers alone. No hand but hers measured what went into the broth. Later testimony would describe an odor that clung faintly to the soup. Not rotten, not spoiled, something else. Like iron, one maid said, like pennies held too long in the mouth. Others noted its color, darker than usual, its taste metallic, its smell heavy, and yet no complaint was raised. For the broth was the only thing the children would take, and each sip drew them further into silence. By late July, the boy was scarcely more than a shadow against the sheets. His body consumed his voice, reduced to a rasp that pleaded only for broth. The nurse came each dusk as before, the tin bowl in her hands, her lullaby low and steady. The doctor praised her devotion. The family clung to her persistence as the only constancy left in the sick room. The journals preserve the sequence of failure. Bloodletting calomel laudanum, each trial written in hurried strokes, each followed by the same refrain, no cure. Yet beside these medical notations, the kitchen book did not falter. Broth daily. Even as the boy's veins emptied, even as his gums blackened, the broth alone remained. Those who were there remembered the smell that clung to the room. Not the odor of sickness, though that was present, but something sharper, faint metallic, rising with the steam that followed the nurse wherever she went. A maid swore that even the linens carried it, as though the broth itself had soaked through the house. No record states what bones filled the pot in those weeks. The ration book lists no extra hogs, no purchases from neighboring farms. And yet, the broth was never absent, its supply unbroken even as provisions dwindled. The source is left unwritten, preserved only in rumor. Rumor that ran quietly through the quarters, where shallow mounds marked children's graves and where earth was disturbed more than once. The fever tightened its hold. By the final week, the boy no longer stirred at touch. His eyes, half open, clouded his lips, whispering thirst. The physician, exhausted, wrote only single words: now, pulse faint, skin cold, death near. And still the broth was carried upstairs. Still the lullaby was hummed. Still the spoon touched the child's lips. In the planter's diary, frustration gave way to something like resignation. The final entry for the second son reads, only July 28th, fever unbroken, Broth given. Child failing. After this, the record falls silent. The contrast is stark when read side by side. In the house, dates, dosages, ounces of blood, the sterile collapse of science. In the quarters, images passed mouth to mouth, the shape of cloth bundles, the sound of earth disturbed after midnight. One record names the fever. The other remembers the hands that lingered at the grave. Neither contradicts the other. Together they complete what each alone concealed. The silences are the loudest part. Nowhere in the planter's journal is the broth questioned. Nowhere in the physician's notes is the nurse described beyond her usefulness. She exists only as function. She fed, she soothed, she obeyed. Yet, in the recollections of those who watched from below, her silence was not absence, but power. A woman who could move between the worlds of the dying and the living, between the house and the quarters, carrying with her what was meant to stay buried. By August, 2 small graves had been marked in the slave cemetery, their mounds uneven, their soil unsettled. By August, 2 white children upstairs had wasted into weakness under her spoon. The pattern no longer looked like chance. It looked like design, a rhythm, stitched by hands that stirred both dirt and broth. The overseer, blind to all but lateness and order, noted her delays again. Mammy absent after dusk. The planter, consumed by his ledger of loss, tallied fevers marked decline, closed his entries in anger. Only the quarters remembered her figure bent against the moonlight. Remembered the sound of her humming. Remembered that what the earth refused to hold, she carried away. Years later, when strangers came asking for histories, it was these fragments that surfaced. Not the doctor's mercury, not the ounces of blood, but the sight of cloth held close, the smell of broth that never cooled, the way sickness rose in the house each time the soil was turned. Memory stitched its own ledger, one that could not be reduced to a line of ink. By the final weeks of August, the house had settled into a rhythm of silence. Meals were rituals without appetite, bowls placed before listless children, broth sipped as though by reflex. The nurse's humming threaded through it all, a sound as constant as the fire that never dimmed. The physician's notes dwindled to fragments, pulse faint, appetite gone, broth taken. His letters to colleagues betray only bafflement written in tight script that circles the same unanswered question. If nothing else is kept down, why does the child accept only her broth? The query trails off without resolution. His ink blotched where the page faltered. The planter's own handwriting, once sharp with complaint, softened into resignation. They live by what she brings, he wrote. No speculation, no suspicion, only the weary acceptance of dependence. In his mind, the broth was mercy, the last thread between his children and the grave. To the quarters, it was something else entirely. Stories whispered that each spoonful carried more than marrow, that the taste of iron on the tongue was not accident, that the nurse's silence was not submission but power exercised in plain sight. When the broth passed the children's lips, it bound them to the same earth their playmates had already entered. Not illness, not chance, but a tether pulled taut between graveyard and nursery, between soil and spoon. The evidence left behind is skeletal only in the most literal sense. Ledgers that reduce grief to single words. Coffins that yield less than they should. Whispers that survived because they were spoken softly enough to escape punishment. Together, They converge on the same image, the fire in the kitchen, the pot that never cooled, the broth that never stopped. By early September, the diary entries thinned into near nothing. One final line appears, written in a cramped hand at the bottom of the page, as though added in haste before the ink dried. Child worsened. Broth given. No cure. After that, the record breaks. The pattern held with such precision that even in retrospect, it reads less like chance than choreography. A burial below, a fever above, a mound raised, a bowl ladled. The symmetry too tight to ignore, yet never named in the records. Neighbors described the Harwood children as one delicate fading, words that circled illness without anchoring it to cause. Physicians prescribed more bleeding, more powders, while their journals reveal only bafflement. But in the quarter's cause was never in doubt. The connection between earth and broth, between shallow graves and silent suppers, did not need proving. It was accepted as truth carried in whispers, preserved in silence. The nurse moved between both worlds with the same steady gait, her face unreadable, her hands always busy. To the family, she was indispensable. To the cabins, she was untouchable. Fear clothed her more tightly than any fabric. No one dared accuse. No one dared intervene. She occupied a space outside the reach of both punishment and gratitude, a figure whose service sustained even as it consumed. The traces left to history are skeletal, but they align. Ledgers that reduce lives to absence. Surveyor's notes that mark missing skulls, missing ribs. Diaries that repeat the word broth until it reads like ritual. Letters that remark on silence heavier than grief. None state the conclusion aloud, yet all circle the same hollow center. By September's end, the household entered a stillness so deep that visitors ceased to come. The yard remained empty. The playthings untouched, the air around the dining table heavy as lead. The planter's final entry for the season reads only, "Illness continues. They eat what she brings." After that, no words remain. The child's decline is traced only in fragments, but together they sketch the shape of inevitability. The planter's diary shifts tone in September. Gone are the clipped notations of fever and wasting. In their place appear words more plaintive, almost pleading. The youngest weakens. Pray he endure. Pray she sustain him. The pronouns blur his faith, placed not in God, but in the nurse who hovered over the bed with her ever-present bowl. Neighbors recalled later that the boy had been seen once on the porch, pale and listless, his limbs thin as reeds. One described the sight as unsettling, as though the child were fading before the eyes. Another noted the strange hush that followed, the way the household withdrew behind closed shutters, refusing callers. Silence became both shield and signal. In the quarters, whispers traveled quickly. Children counted the mounds in the burial field, marked which stones were new, and fell quiet when the nurse's figure passed in the dusk. Her bundle in hand, her steps steady, she moved from graveyard to kitchen as though crossing a threshold only she could traverse. Adults did not speak of it aloud, but the absence of playmates, the thinned graves, the simmering pot told its own story. The parish register for late September records only a single stark line. Harwood child male, age 5 illness, continuing outcome doubtful. No outcome is listed after. The line trails into silence, the register turns its page, and the name disappears from record. Yet, the soil remembers what ink omits. Excavation of the final mound, small, shallow, marked by a single upright stone, revealed no skull, no ribs, only fragments of coffin wood and earth clawed as if by hand. The grave gave back emptiness, a mirror of the household above. It is here the pattern ends, not because it ceased, but because nothing further remains. No more children in the planter's line. No more entries of fevers unbroken. Only the echo of silence carried forward in whispers and in absence. In later decades, when descendants sought to reconstruct the Harvard line, they encountered only gaps. The parish ledgers list no heirs after 1833. The estate inventories preserve furniture livestock acreage, but no mention of children. What remained was silence, and silence cannot inherit. Archaeologists who opened the quarter's burial field in the 20th century noted the same dissonance. Mounds without bodies, coffins collapsed into soil-scattered bones, missing essential parts. Reports described the ground as disturbed beyond expectation, as though emptied by deliberate hand. The findings aligned uneasily with letters preserved in private collections, fragments that spoke of broth of silence at table of children, fading in unison. Local memory carried the story further still. Folklore in the county spoke of a mammy who fed too faithfully, a shadow who moved between graves and kitchen, whose pot smoked with a smell, half metallic, half sweet. Children were warned not to linger near the old Harvard grounds, lest they be called to supper by a voice that never spoke. In these tales, the nurse did not die, but remained silent, spoon in hand, tending her eternal table. Whether these stories preserve truth or only the residue of fear is impossible to say. What is certain is the absence. Records that note every hog and hinge grow strangely vague when they reach her. Diaries that praised her constancy fall quiet after her work is done. An entire bloodline ends, and the hand that carried it there dissolves into clerical haze. The plantation house itself did not last the century. By the 1870s, it stood in ruin, its dining hall collapsed, its nursery open to rain. Travelers who passed along the road remarked on the silence of the place, an echo of the hush once described within. Walls crumble, but silence lingers. What does it mean when the most faithful figure leaves no trace? Perhaps erasure was itself the final ritual, an attempt to bury, not a body, but a memory, too dangerous to preserve. Yet, the fragments remain, ledger grave, letter enough to suggest a pattern sharp as confession, though never spoken aloud. The margins whisper what the columns refuse to admit. Each annotation disturbed, incomplete, absent, reads less as clerical duty than as a private act of conscience, a mark left by men who saw but dared not speak. Their restraint produced a strange ledger, an official record that pretends toward neutrality, and a ghost text in the margins that testifies to violation without naming it. By the 1870s, local rumor had absorbed these absences into something larger than fact. Parish children dared each other to walk past the old graveyard at dusk, warning that the smallest plots sank lower each year as though the ground itself was swallowing them anew. Women at wakes whispered that bones taken from infants never rested, that they rattled in kitchens where broth simmered too long. When antiquarians from Louisville examined the registers in the early 20th century, they struggled to categorize what they found. One wrote, "This is less record than palimpsest, as if a second text has been written in silence beneath the first." Another noted that in each case the margin notations align chronologically with the Harwood deaths, as though the shadow of that household had spread into the parish itself, and still the gaps persist. The graves remain shallow, the coffins incomplete, the ledgers broken by torn lines. What began as clerical remark has become over time a tradition of silence, a refusal repeated so faithfully that it begins to resemble liturgy. It is here that the nurse re-enters, not as figure, but as absence. Her erasure mirrors the missing bones, the struck-out lines, the annotations that never resolve. She is present, not where ink endures, but where it fails. The faithful one remembered only through what is missing. The Harwood family graves recorded with care and ornament appear in the registers without blemish. Their coffins sealed, their bodies intact. Only in the section of the enslaved did the strange annotations surface tucked into margins, like stains the record could not quite erase. Silence in an official archive can weigh heavier than testimony. Here, the refusal to explain why children's bones were missing became the loudest entry. What the priests knew, they reduced to fragments. What they suspected, they left unwritten. Taken together, the parish records, the annotations, the later surveys, they form a grim ledger of omission. They tell us what was seen disturbed earth, incomplete bodies, bones, gone. They tell us nothing of who took them or why. That absence, deliberate and careful, may be the most damning record of all. Why does silence in the archives speak louder than words? Because silence is chosen. And in Greene County, silence wrapped itself around every disturbed grave as though memory had been buried with the children who were never allowed to rest whole. When the ledgers fall quiet, when parish registers give only blanks and erasures, the nurse's figure returns elsewhere in whispers. The Works Progress Administration interviews of the 1930s preserve thin strands of recollection. Scattered half-buried in stories of fields, cabins, and overseers, certain phrases persist. One voice recalled a woman who lingered at graves longer than the rest, who took something back with her. Another asked about food in the master's house, muttered, "They ate more than corn and broth." Family tales a century later sharpened the edge. "She gave them back what they gave us," one descendant said. "Fed their own into their mouths so they'd know." To record, she was faithful. To memory, she was both caretaker and avenger. She did not poison with herbs or powders, but with the remains of those already taken. Bones boiled into broth, marrow stirred into sustenance. The archive insists on her absence. Woman deceased. Oral tradition insists on her presence, the hand behind the spoon. Between them lies dissonance. Written silence against spoken memory, omission against insistence. Around the fire the tale ended always the same way, with quiet. No laughter, no explanation, only hush. As if silence itself was the last inheritance. The final pages of the Harwood record resolve nothing. The planter's diary ends with a single line, "Nowhere remains." The parish ledger shows only blanks where burial notes should have stood. The household inventory, precise to the last tool, allows one sparse entry, "Woman deceased." The bowls never described appear only in ration logs, broth daily. Yet, their repetition is the true record, each portion ladled by the same hand, each spoonful coinciding with decline. If it was fever alone, the record would have said so plainly. Instead, it collapses into erasure's torn lines and silence. And so the image that lingers is this: a quiet dining room. Children pale and too weak to quarrel. Candlelight falling on untouched bowls. Behind them, the nurse steady, silent spoon in hand. Were they undone by illness? Or were they fed the bones of their playmates, marrow stirred into nightly broth? The archive refuses to say. The soil, the missing bones, the erased name suggest otherwise. The Harwood line ended in silence. The graves remain. The bones do not. History records absence, but absence too can speak. This is the 7th mark. If you wish to hear more histories buried in ledgers and erased from memory, subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. And remember, the darkest truths are often the ones written only as blanks.